Good morning, everyone, or almost good afternoon. My name is Whitney Sikonic. I am a master's level psychologist and a board certified behavior analyst, or BCBA, as you'll hear a lot through this presentation today. And I am the clinical director at the Autism Society of North Carolina, and am very excited to be here with you today to talk about this topic.
Great. Thank you, Whit. Kim Tizard, I'm the Director of Family Support here at the Autism Society of North Carolina. And I am also a proud mom of a wonderful young man who is on the autism spectrum. And you'll hear a little bit more about him as I give some examples throughout my portion of the presentation.
Thanks, Kim. I'm so honored and happy to be here with Whitney and Kim today. My name is Louise Southern, and I'm the Associate Clinical Director for the Autism Society. I'm also, like Whitney, a board certified behavior analyst, and my background is also in special education. My PhD is in curriculum instruction, and I spend a lot of time in my role working with school districts directly on providing workshops and training, as well as classroom-based coaching, and in some cases, student-specific consultation to support school systems across North Carolina. So we're really happy to be here with you all today. Thank you. Why are we here? Well, public school systems, as we know, across North Carolina and across the country really, are certainly seeing a rise in the number of students identified as having autism. And of course, public schools have a responsibility under the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, or IDEA, to provide appropriate services to students within the spectrum. And we know that within this audience, there are at least two major stakeholder groups. There are parents or caregivers of students with autism, and there are also educators, including district level leadership within this audience. At times, and in some contexts, it seems like these two groups take very different positions on this issue of ABA in schools. At the Autism Society of North Carolina, we regularly partner with families and autistic individuals. That is core to our mission. And we also partner with school systems and other organizations across North Carolina. That is also part of our mission. So we are not taking one single position on this issue, of course, but rather we hope to further educate the community on this complex topic. We hope that all audience members here today, educators, families, autistic individuals, and others will come away from this webinar with an understanding that our position, that behavior analytic strategies and principles are not incompatible with education. It does not have to be this way or that way. There can actually be another way. So what are the objectives of this webinar? First and foremost, we want to examine the relationship between the science of behavior analysis and education. We also want to clarify differences between evidence-based practices versus comprehensive methodologies. We also want to outline factors for families to consider if they are pursuing behavior analytic services within the public school context. And finally, we want to provide guidelines for our fellow behavior analysts, as well as families and school districts to consider when they are working together within a school context. So some families, first and foremost, it's important to say that some families and school-based professionals may not be aware of the long-standing relationship between the science of behavior analysis and education. As one example, this has been evident to me in a few cases where I've heard school-based staff say something along the lines of, well, we don't do those ABA techniques here. And when I've heard this, to be honest with you all, I want to say, are you sure about that? So the reality is that behavior analytic practices and principles are inextricably woven into the fabric of high quality, appropriate educational services. And they have been for a long time. Most high quality teacher preparation programs, including the ones that I attended as a college and graduate student, for example, those training programs for general and special education teachers provide training and coursework on such topics as classroom management, learning theory, and positive behavior support. These courses include a number of principles and strategies or practices that are rooted in the science of behavior analysis. It's also important to say that behavior analytic practices and principles are woven into the fabric deeply of special education. A number of high leverage practices in special education and evidence-based practices in instruction and behavior support draw directly from this science. But let's examine this relationship a little bit further with some concrete classroom examples. We know that highly effective, appropriate teaching often involves, first and foremost, establishing strong positive relationships with the student. And in part, this is achieved by understanding the student's unique learning characteristics and their preferences. Highly effective teaching also involves frequent, positive, and specific feedback when the student responds correctly during instruction, for example, or when they demonstrate the behaviors that we want to see. Good teaching also involves careful assessment, identifying critical skills and concepts, and then breaking those down into teachable segments or steps or parts. Good teaching also involves using warm-up activities and discussions, tapping into the student's prior knowledge, and reviewing material before introducing new or more challenging concepts. Good teaching also involves targeting concepts and skills that are right at the right instructional level for that student. So staying in the zone of success. Staying at the right instructional level means targeting skills that are not too challenging for that student and are also not too easy for that student. Skills that the student is ready to learn now and to master in the near term. Highly effective teaching also involves organized, frequent, direct instruction. Many students with autism and other learning differences will need frequent opportunities to practice concepts and skills, and each practice opportunity should build on the one before it. Organized instruction involves presenting material in a clear manner, drawing the student's attention to the material, providing necessary supports and necessary prompting to keep the student engaged and successful as they are learning. And this also involves providing clear feedback after each instructional opportunity. Effective teaching also involves carefully fading out supports, fading out prompting, as the student demonstrates increased understanding, increased independence. And this fading process also needs to be organized and systematic. All of these features that I've just described relate directly to what we would consider frequent and organized direct instruction, which is a high leverage practice in special education. We also know that highly effective teaching involves reminding students of expectations in advance. So I'm thinking, I was in a classroom yesterday, actually, in a kindergarten classroom, and I saw the teacher say to the young students something along the lines of, okay, everybody, when we line up, remember, what do we need to do? And some of the students responded, we got to put a bubble in our mouth. We need to keep our hands to ourselves. The teacher used that preventative proactive strategy to remind students of the expectations before they lined up. This is a tried and true preventative practice, and it relates to highly effective teaching. Or last week, I was in a classroom where I saw a teacher reviewing a social story with a student with autism. And the social story was focused on using appropriate conversational topics while in the cafeteria setting. And the teacher reviewed this social story with this student just before they went into the cafeteria. Again, this is another example of reminding students in advance of expected performance. This is highly effective teaching. Highly effective teaching also involves using strategically timed proactive breaks. This is relevant in both general and special education contexts. Breaks for movement, brain breaks, and so forth. And some of our students with autism are going to need those breaks to be very carefully timed, even more frequent, and proactively and preventatively applied to support their unique sensory and behavioral needs. Highly effective teaching also involves the use of data collection, data on the student's academic and social behavioral progress, for instance, to help drive decision-making, to help the teaching staff determine, is the student making progress in these skill areas? Highly effective teaching also for students with higher behavior support needs also involves the use of data collection to help the team understand what might be influencing some of the behaviors that they are observing, and to help evaluate the effectiveness of the interventions that that team is applying to better support that student's behavioral needs. And highly effective teaching also involves looking at challenging behavior through the right lenses, all the right lenses. And in the case of autism, this requires that we first and foremost look at behavior, challenging behavior, if it does occur, through the lens of that student's autism. All of these principles and practices that I've just outlined on these last two slides represent some of the best practices in instruction and behavior support. And these, at least in part or in full, draw directly or evolved directly from the science of behavior analysis. And in the terms of autism, and specially designed instruction for a student who might have an IEP, for example, highly effective teaching involves the integration of evidence-based practices. The integration of evidence-based practices that evolved from maybe from different methodological camps or from different philosophical orientations. Integration of these evidence-based practices is important as well. So I'm trying to illustrate to you all the ways in which the science of behavior analysis is already woven into the fabric of education and into the fabric of special education as well. Many of you all, parents, and certainly you educators in this audience, I know have seen this framework before, but this represents what's called a multi-tiered system of supports model. And this is a proactive and preventative framework that integrates data and instruction to maximize a student's achievement and to support a student's social, emotional, and behavioral needs, as well as their academic needs. This model has been adopted by varying degrees by nearly every school system in North Carolina. This is a proactive intervention and supports model that's designed to enhance the overall school climate and culture, to focus on building the behaviors we want to see in our students, to intervene early and effectively when we're seeing problems with academic or social behavioral performance within a student, and to improve. Big broad aims of this model are to improve academic achievement outcomes and graduation rates, to reduce office disciplinary referral and suspension rates, and to address disparities in these trends that we also know exist within schools across North Carolina and beyond. And what's important about this slide, and the reason I'm presenting it to you all, is that many of the evidence-based positive behavior support practices included within this three-tiered model of support evolved directly from the science of behavior analysis. So in that way, models such as PBIS or MTSS represent in part the scaling up of behavior analysis to the class-wide and whole school level. And as parents and as educators, where we might see some of the more visible examples of some of these school and class-wide supports that are part of this MTS framework, well, for example, many schools in North Carolina outline specific behavioral expectations, and they teach all students within that school what these expectations are. And you can see an example of this over here with this SOAR framework, which spells out certain behaviors that are expected within various contexts within this overall school setting. And the aim is to teach students what these expectations are, to model these expectations, and to frequently acknowledge students who are demonstrating these expected behaviors, and to apply reinforcement towards these behaviors. And so we can see how these reinforcement procedures play out through examples such as Class Dojo. I'm the parent of 3 boys myself. My youngest child, the whole school uses Class Dojo as a way to communicate with parents, but also as a way to issue individual student points, as well as class-wide points, where children are then working towards a larger reward, such as a pizza party. So this is just one of the many examples of the ways that we see some of the principles of behavior analysis influencing whole school and class-wide models of positive behavior support, scaling up behavior analysis across these schools and systems. Again, my point here is trying to illustrate to you all that elements of behavior analysis are already woven into the fabric of high quality education. Behavior analysis is certainly inextricably linked with our school-based behavior intervention plans. So a high quality, appropriate, robust behavior intervention plan draws largely from the science of behavior analysis, and we see many principles and practices playing out within a behavior intervention plan framework. Some of the most critical and guiding questions that a team uses when they're developing a behavior intervention plan, or when they're doing a functional behavior assessment, for example, that would help them to develop this behavior intervention plan, some of those fundamental questions draw directly from our understanding of the science of learning and the science of behavior, from the science of behavior analysis. So key questions like, what does this behavior look like? In what form is this behavior taking? Objectively, what does this behavior look like? What influences or triggers this behavior? Based on the data we have, what patterns are we seeing around when this behavior occurs or when it doesn't occur, for example? Under what conditions are we often seeing this behavior occur? What is this behavior communicating to us? What are the unmet needs that this behavior is expressing? What purpose does this behavior serve? Those key questions are draw directly from the science of behavior analysis and the principles and understanding of behavior. Other key questions: what will we teach the student to do instead? What will we teach the student to do instead to get his or her their needs met? Specifically, when we think about behavior intervention plans that are high quality, that are appropriately developed, that are effective, some of the key questions we have to be able to answer within those behavior intervention plans are: how will we prevent this behavior? What will we reinforce? What behaviors will we reinforce instead? How will we respond or react if this behavior does occur? Are we following this plan consistently? Are our interventions working? What does the data tell us? So many of these questions are answered by the contribution of the science of behavior analysis. And this framework for behavior intervention plans draws largely from our science of behavior analysis. So again, we are seeing how education, when it's high quality and appropriate, and behavior analysis are already inextricably linked together. We also know, and I realize that we're here to talk mostly about autism and students with autism, but we know that behavior analysis has relevance across many different student populations, students who do not have a disability, as well as students who fall under other disability categories, such as attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, intellectual disability, emotional disability, and so forth. We also know that the established scientific community has identified, in recent years, they've published another report, kind of a study that synthesizes a lot of research done in autism. And this study has identified 28 evidence-based practices in autism. And what's important to say about these 28 evidence-based practices in autism as it relates to the topic of ABA is that at least 50% of the 28 evidence-based practices in autism come directly from the science of behavior analysis. And another 20% of those 28 evidence-based practices at least incorporate some behavior analytic principles or strategies into that packaged intervention. Examples of that would be things like social narratives or social stories, video modeling, picture exchange communication systems, pivotal response teaching, and parent-mediated interventions. So again, we see how behavior analysis is not only woven into the fabric of education, but it's also woven into the fabric of our understanding of evidence-based practices in autism. Who can apply behavior analytic strategies? I'm a BCBA. I'm also a former educator, but we're here to say that, to be very clear on the point, that it's not just those who hold the credential of BCBA who can apply behavior analytic strategies. School teachers, of course, educators, administrators, the bus drivers, cafeteria workers, and of course, parents and caregivers can certainly be taught and supported in applying behavior analytic strategies. This is an important point to make. Behavior analysis is a science, and that science can be applied, the strategies that draw from that science can be applied by a number of different stakeholders. But it is also important, one of the things we wanted to do in this webinar was to help draw some delineation or distinction between evidence-based practices, including behavior analytic strategies, versus comprehensive treatment methodologies. And so again, I said, who can apply evidence-based practices in autism, or who can apply evidence-based practices and including behavior analytic strategies? Educators, administrators, family members, and so forth, right? That's important to say. With training and support, educators can apply various behavior analytic strategies effectively and to fidelity. But again, I want to draw this distinction between evidence-based practices and the comprehensive treatment methodology. So comprehensive treatment methodologies would include applied behavior analysis, capital A, capital B, capital A. And in that context, that methodology is applied by a highly qualified professional, one who is typically licensed and or certified in the discipline of behavior analysis. As a comprehensive methodology, when compared to like evidence-based practices, as a comprehensive methodology or treatment approach, ABA involves a set of practices that are formally packaged together. These practices are systematically applied with precision and to fidelity. These procedures and protocols are clearly defined, very clearly spelled out, so that they can be replicated. There's very frequent and precise data collection that supports the process and supports decision-making. This is a comprehensive approach where all the skills targeted involve the application of behavior analytic principles and practices. So when you glue all these features together, this is what constitutes a methodology. This is an important distinction. It's also a distinction that, for example, the North Carolina Department of Public Instruction has sought to make as well. And so David Laxton, our communications director, is going to be dropping a link into the chat at the end of our webinar that provides a link to this guidance document that was developed by the North Carolina Department of Public Instruction, because this is yet another helpful resource to you all in understanding how NCDPI distinguishes between methodologies, comprehensive methodologies or treatment methodologies such as ABA versus research-based practices or evidence-based practices, some of which again might draw from the science of behavior analysis. So with that, Kim's going to take us into our next section.
Great. Thank you so much, Louise. Oh boy, that is so much to take in. And even though my son's 27, I remember the early days of IEP meetings and prepping for IEP meetings and feeling like this cute puppy. Not that I'm a cute puppy, but jumping through hoops, trying to have everything just right. If I don't say things the right way or ask for things in the right way, am I really going to be getting my son what he needs? So I know so many of you parents that are listening right now, and I bet if we have some teachers and educators joining us as well, probably feel much like this, like jumping through hoops. All right. So the next slide, I'm going to spend a few minutes just talking about this a bit. And I would lovingly say to you all to just buckle up for a second, because we do want to touch on this a little bit. And I know that Louise did mention what Individuals with Disabilities Education Act is. And but what I want to talk about are the 3 principles under IDEA. And one of the first ones is to think about how our local education agencies, you all may see just LEAs, and state-operated programs are required to provide free, appropriate public education. And we're going to refer that to as FAPE, to all students with disabilities covered by the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. The decision on what is appropriate for the student who qualifies for special education and related services is determined by each student's individualized education program. And that includes you as a parent. You have a strong voice in that. And we're not going to take a deep dive into all the aspects of an IEP. Today, we've got some wonderful tools, toolkits, all kinds of stuff on our website. I love some of the resource documents that our friends over at the Exceptional Children's Assistance Center have as well. If you're interested in a deeper dive on some of this, I want to try to stay focused today on what our topic is. But some things that are important to point out when we talk about FAPE is the definition of appropriate. And oftentimes that's not clearly defined, which can lead to some real misunderstandings. Think in terms of appropriate instruction to meet the goals. What does the progress look like? And it's not just about those academic pieces. It's also about the social behavior and communication that's involved. And what can some of those social, emotional, or behavior challenges, is that making it difficult for the child to learn? Something that can be a hard pill to swallow sometimes is that FAPE does not require schools to provide the best services possible for kids or maximize their potential. FAPE does not require schools to provide specific programs or class settings that a parent or caregiver wants for their child. And so sometimes that can be hard. That, what FAPE does offer is that the parents are a member of those IEP teams. And it does offer, are we really helping the child reach what is appropriate for them? And sometimes that's not always what's best, but what appropriate is really important. What's going to maximize their learning? And we're going to kind of delve into that a bit more as we move on today. But a couple of things to point out real quickly here is also the least restrictive environment. And the least restrictive environment should help maximize the extent possible children are educated with their non-disabled peers. Please keep in mind that there's a number of factors to consider here when discussing the least restrictive environment. What's your child's academic level? What are their self-help skills, sensory issues, or behavioral issues? The IEP, again, and because we're not going to take a deep dive into what the IEP is, but one common question that I often get is, what can I even ask for in my child's IEP? And the resource specialists that work for the Autism Society across the state of North Carolina, one of the first things we'll ask or repeat back is, what does your child need? Let's help break that down and let's think about that. However, today we are going to focus a bit on the behavior analytic strategies and how we can address much of what Louise said throughout the IEP. And so the next couple of slides that we're going to be talking about is going to take that little bit of a deeper dive. A couple questions to think about when you see this slide, and just kind of keep in mind, you have your general education and your core curriculum, etc. FAPE kicks in for those that who qualify for FAPE because of their occurring disability as that came through their DSM-5 and their area of eligibility comes in the FAPE bubble. And then you've got your 504 kiddos and then your IEPs, those that qualify in that level. But a couple questions to think about for both our school professionals and as caregivers in regards to our focus for today. How can we achieve reasonable educational progress? That's one. Is it challenging? And does it provide the opportunity to learn new skills? We want to think about that. That was something Louise touched on as well. Are there behaviors that continue to interfere with their learning? And I'm going to give you a little personal story right here, because it took me a minute as a parent. When I thought about behaviors when my son was younger, I thought it was like if he was kicking or screaming or jumping up. And yes, those behaviors can exist as well. But for Trevor, it looked like he would plug his ears, cover his eyes, and put his head down on his desk. He was quiet. He wasn't bothering anybody. He wasn't disturbing anyone. And so I didn't think of that as behavior. But of course, that was behavior. It was preventing him from learning and being active in his learning environment. So it's really important that we're looking at some of those, what that behavior looks like and what those challenges are. Are you seeing minimal progress? Or are you seeing goals that are being cut and pasted and being carried over? If you are, this is a red flag. Goals need to be ambitious and academic and functional. Goal progress must be met too. Again, are there behaviors that continue to interfere with learning? The example I just gave you of my son was a perfect example of how that was interfering with his learning. Often we think about IEPs and we think about the academic goals, which are a very important integral part of many IEPs. And it's how we are accessing that standard course of study and curriculum for our kiddos. But we also need to think about those functional goals, those social and behavior struggles that may be keeping our loved one from accessing the academic environment. This is why it is so important to look at the whole picture through a new lens. And it's much of what we heard Louise talk about. You're going to hear Whitney talk even more about that. How can we get to the core of that behavior? What evidence-based practices may have already been tried? Is something working? If not, do we need to take a harder look at some of the available evidence-based practices, especially how that relates to comprehensive treatment approaches and much of that methodology that you heard Louise talk about? This oftentimes can mean and does mean that specially designed instruction is imperative. An example is a student who may have a reading challenge and may be taught with a multi-sensory, reading program. And this does bring me back to a wonderful kiddo that I was at an IEP meeting some years ago, and very, very intelligent, good comprehension, but he needed a reading program where he could have, even while he was in his class, he needed to have the, oh my gosh, Louise or Whit, help here for a second. He needed to be able to hear the teacher give the lesson, but it had to go directly into an audio device that he had. There's a specific audio device. Even though he wasn't hearing impaired, it's how he learned best, is to have that device, as well as seeing things in front of him in the book and being able to follow along and guided notes. And these are all of some of those great examples that Louise spoke about in some really good evidence-based practices that can be woven within the fabric that was uniquely available and something that was going to help him become very successful. Let's not forget about some of the accommodations and modifications, because that's what I'm talking about. And how can we help kids learn and participate in the general education curriculum? Those audio books, extra time on schoolwork, that's examples of accommodations. Teaching kids in the least restrictive environment. All of this is so important. Aren't in the same order. So as I said, we're not going to take a deep dive into the individualized education program, but we did want to point out, when you're looking at some of these methodologies or behavior analytic strategies, where can we put those within the IEP? And without going too deep, we're going to talk about these 6 areas and give some examples. So we're going to take a quick pick into these 3. One of the most important spots is the parent concerns. I actually was talking to a parent recently, just a few days ago, and I noticed that the parent concerns kind of said that we didn't really have any at this time. And we talked through that. And I said, actually, all these things that you're thinking about that you want the school to address, those are your parent concerns. And that's important to have in here. Be thinking about the total school environment, not just within the classroom. We want to also think about not just that academic focus as well. Remember the importance of those functional goals that help them reach those wonderful academic goals. They enable your child to learn the basic skills. So be thinking in those terms. How can they become more independent and self-sufficient within the school environment? Some of these skills might include communication, social skills, and the ability to interact with others. Think about those group activities that would be required, especially as we get in some of the upper grades in middle school and high school. Some of my son's things that I would put down is he didn't understand stop and wait when he was little. That's a safety risk, especially if they were headed out to a playground that didn't have any type of fencing around it. That was a concern for us. He didn't know how to ask for help. That's why he was shutting down. He was unplugging his ears. Some other examples of some concerns could be, gosh, every time my daughter's asked to write, she rips up the paper. Or John loves recess, but wants to just play chase. I wish he knew how to play with the other kids more typically with his class peers. You don't have to have the perfect words. These are all really important concerns. And it's important to remember that you don't have to ask things perfectly. You and your IEP team should be unpacking these concerns. Are you actively involved? So I know there's a few different camps that have joined us today. We may have some parents whose kiddos are involved right now, whether in a clinic setting or have an ABA program within their home. We may have some that wish they could have that, and they're hoping they can get more of that at school. And then there may be some who've joined us today who are trying to get a better understanding and still a little undecided about this whole ABA thing, or may feel very strongly that it's something that they may not be interested in. But this is where you, if you are, have an active, board certified behavior analyst that's working with you, you've got some great ideas that you're working on in a more, in a setting that could be really conducive for that early learning. And then we want to talk about how are we going to take that and generalize it in this setting, and thinking about those things and how can we embed those in these 6 components is what we would like to talk about today and more of. And Whitney's going to take a little bit more of a dive in how that can look like in the classroom. Another super important aspect of the IEP is your present level of academic functional performance. I like to just say the PLAF. It's not as big and a mouthful. Think back to the amazing examples that Louise already gave us, talking about highly effective teaching. How can we embed those within that present level of functioning? What I like to tell parents is when you pick up your child's IEP and you read the present level of the PLAF, to make it a little bit easier, when you read that, does it represent your child well? Is it robust? Does it talk about what they're doing well, where their challenges are, what helps them be successful? That's what's really important, are these very well written, it's a mouthful, tongue twister, in that present level. It's really important, and to try to be as specific as possible. The annual goals are directly taken from the present levels, and they should be concrete and measurable. Can they be accomplished within 12 months or within the life of that IEP? Very, very important. Another important aspect of your individualized education plan is the prior written notice. So often I'll tell families, are there some things that you did a handshake? I call it like a handshake, like, ooh, we want to try that. We'd like to try that for a trial period before we actually add it into the present level or as a goal. That's something that can be written in that prior written notice. I was recently at a IEP meeting with an amazing group, everybody. I'm going to talk briefly about the importance of collaboration, etc. They were all working so well together, and the BCBA was present, and this lovely young lady, has some challenges in staying on task. And there was just wonderful open conversation on how they were getting success at home, because the BCBA is able to be in an environment where she can try some things out and figured out what was working. And the teacher was so excited to hear that and wants the BCBA to come to school and show them how to do that. And so we made sure that was in the prior written notice, that she is going to come in for an hour, and so that they can watch her work. And this goes back to what Louise was talking about. When we talk about just that methodology and the level of training and expertise that some of our BCBAs have, that they can be there to support if they're allowed to. And I know even me just saying that, the questions are probably going to start flying in, on that as well. And we'll touch on that. The importance of the accommodations, breaking tasks down into smaller steps, using visual timers, etc. Also really important to make sure that the accommodations is another area that we're embedding some of those wonderful strategies. The behavior intervention plan, thank you, Louise, for your information on that and what makes a really great behavior intervention plan. That is probably such an important place to have that very well written, very specifically spelled out. I even like to see it done in a way that the steps are almost in a sequential order. So whoever picks that up, whether it's the PE coach or the art teacher, that they can see these steps and they're clearly outlined. Really important too. And last but not least is come prepared. We've given you already so much information. I know you're feeling like that pup jumping through the hoops again, but have those conversations with your outside support people, your speech therapists, your occupational therapists, your BCBAs, who's supporting outside of the school, and how can we get those strategies, those tools, those things that are working in those contexts or those environments, how can we take that and move it here into their school environment so they can have success? All right, I apologize. This slide is my soapbox. I won't stick here too long, but I will tell you I have been to countless IEPs, and this right here is where things get stuck. And it goes back to the parent asking for something. I'll give you an example. I said, I want my child to read. What they said in the IEP team meeting was, well, that's not going to happen. He's not going to read. And I think now, looking back, was they didn't mean he's not going to read. It's just not in this lifetime of this particular IEP. We have to break it down into steps. And I cannot tell you all enough, both parent and professionals, that we have to look at our words. We have to watch our tone. We have to watch our body language. Everybody doesn't have the answers. You need to come together and make sure that each other understands what is being asked and understand what's being said on both sides. And I cannot say this enough, because typically, a family shouldn't need to have to bring additional support to help bridge this gap. It should be that both sides are taking the time to truly understand what's being asked and what's being said, and having those, oh, my son, when he has his aha moments, his eyebrows go up. It's like, oh, that's what they're asking me. Well, that's how I see parents and teachers when we are able to be there and we can't be at all IEP meetings, those aha moments. Oh, that's what you were asking. Okay, this is one of my favorite slides, and I want to thank Louise and Whitney for helping pull it together. But these are some of the common concerns that we are so often hearing. And I didn't have a whole lot of additional to add to this because they were spot on with this. And this goes back to the semantics, to really listening to what the parent is really asking for. Don't assume that they are insinuating that you are failing, and vice versa, parents. The professionals, we should all be coming together and trying to answer some of these questions. And these can be concerns that can be back up in the parent concern section on the IEP. My child's not making the progress that I wish they were. The behavior needs aren't being met. They're still getting up and jumping and running out of the room when they're asked to do an unpreferred task, or shutting down. My teacher or the support staff, I don't know that they have the necessary training they need because they are still doing these things. And I'm not going to read each of these aspects, but this is what we're hearing. This is commonly what we so often hear, and the resource specialists that work across the state in all of the different school districts that we work with. And so often, back to even my example, in saying, and I found myself saying exactly some of these same things, but it was because I didn't understand all the steps necessary to help get my son to where he needed to be either. So these are some of the common concerns, and families, I would tell you to think about this, and it's okay to have these addressed within your IEPs. What are we really asking for? And I'm hoping after today's presentation that you all are having some of those aha moments about what ABA can look like within the school environment. We're really hoping that you can have some of those moments. But I will say that this is almost the elephant in the room. And it is developing that better understanding of what you are looking for. Either, like we said earlier, you may have your child actively engaged in an ABA program or wish that your child was. In this case, you may be excited at the prospect that your school system has either hired or has staff working toward their board certification, or even are just open to learning just the applied behavior analytic strategies, that they're open to this. We also know, though, that there may be some attending today that are not open to that. BCBA staff are not allowed in their school systems. They're not open. Like the teacher, I said, I'll admit, the teacher said, "Oh yes, please come in. We want you to show us how you're doing that." But I could see some of the administrators that were on the call. I kind of saw, we need to talk about this. It's so important that we're taking the time to understand the policies that govern your school system, and learning what those are and how can we get to that win-win and what this can look like. It's our hope, through showing some of these options today, that we can coexist and benefit the child's unique needs. Great, thank you. Things to consider when you're even asking and wanting. You're thinking, I specifically want ABA. I want what Louise was talking about, as a methodology and that kind of expertise level. So these are some things that we need to think about and consider as well. Is what's the best environment for the child to be served in? Is it within the regular ed classroom? Is a specific goal better done out on the playground? Where can those opportunities for that generalized learning truly take place? What does success look like for this child? And can we achieve this goal by pushing into a least restrictive environment rather than bringing them out to a separate setting. I feel pretty strongly at all the different questions that each of us are asking and telling you throughout this, and you'll receive the PDF of this PowerPoint. These are all great questions to actually bring up during your child's meetings, to think about some of these questions. It's a great way to help get on the same page and kind of help take some of that emotional aspects, out. So thinking about this, and one thing that I'll say is that if you do have a strong BCBA who has the opportunity to spend more time with that child in figuring out what works and can help systematically break down the why into some of these questions, why wouldn't we want their input, whether it's during the IEP meeting or like the one teacher that's going to have that individual come in for an hour and help support and show how they're able to fade. It was in relation to fading a hand over hand prompt. How can we do that to help transition? It's really important that we're answering these questions. We're hearing things and triggers when you even are thinking about some of these things that kiddos are saying, like, I can't do it, or Trevor plugging his ears and putting his head down. And we're making assumptions that means that they don't want to learn, or they've got that behavior and something may not be happening. But how can we take that, incorporating those techniques and move them into classrooms and playgrounds and cafeterias? My next few slides are going to go fairly quickly. I have to tell you that this is one of my favorite slides. And again, I am so thankful for Whitney and Louise for pulling this together. This is the one thing that I said, if I were back and new to all this while Trevor was, because he did do ABA, this is the slide I'd want, because you feel as a parent, and those of you who are also our professionals that are working, you think you need to know all these words, and you family members, you think, if I don't ask for things just the right way, we're not going to get it. That's what this slide is. I've got goosebumps just talking about this slide, you all. Because this is all of the things that you heard Louise talk about, and then you're going to get to hear, Whitney, talk about this some more. And you can see in green, that's the literal, we talk about behavior analytic strategies. We talk about in terms, if we put our clinical hat, that's task analysis. But we know it as, can we not just break this skill down into a smaller step and into parts that are manageable? So I really, really do love this slide, and I thank them so much for creating this. I hope you all will find this helpful, because this is what you can have in the present level. This is the type of language that we can put in there and in those accommodations and within the goals, especially if we know this is what works for the student. How can we get this into the school system setting, and this is it. So anyways, you can tell I'm excited about this slide. I'm not really showing much. My daughter and son are in their mid to late 20s, but I remember when this came out and we saw SpongeBob do communication. This is the core though, right, everybody? We need to communicate better. We need to be open-minded. We need to be flexible. Good communication is the foundation of any successful relationship. And teams must come together with an open mind and a common goal. How can we create trust for all? I had one parent say to me that when she gets into her son's meetings, she said, it's so hard to remove the stigma. And so I would ask you all, when you might enter into an IEP meeting or communication with a family, please have a good idea. And this goes for you all too, families. Leave your bias at the door. And try to identify if you do have bias that's keeping you from seeing the can-dos and only seeing the can'ts. Anywho, I'll jump off of that. So this slide specifically is for parents who do have an active ABA program that your child's involved in, whether it's in your home, clinic-based, could be virtual, whatever it may be. You're the one who has to help be the glue between that program and with the school. Really, really important that you're bringing everybody together and you're discussing what successes you're seeing at home and how can we try this out in the school setting. So I cannot say enough. Louise and Whitney and I were talking with a wonderful parent who's been able to really work with her school system, and it is a smaller school system. But she really said one of the most important things is developing that trust, that they know that she's not coming in with expectations that aren't unreasonable. She has a good understanding of what the school system's policy is. So it's important that we're looking at all those aspects and that you're helping bridge that gap. So, and I'm not going to even spend a lot of time on this slide or the next slide, because again, just it's how important good collaboration is, and good collaboration's intentional. Everybody needs to go in from the get-go with good intents that you want good collaboration. And Whitney's going to really talk some more about this. One point I do want to point out, and I know Whitney will as well, that the ABA team will not and should not be running an IEP meeting. They should not be creating the goals or taking over in the classroom. And Whitney has some fantastic suggestions of what we should expect. Really encouraging creative thinking before choosing an option is also really important. And you have that option of asking for a trial. And again, kind of last but not least, to really hit this home, try to avoid emotional language like "you don't care," "you want to see my child fail," or, you know, vice versa. You know, there's been things been said on the other perspective as well. How can we be supportive? How can we say, well, how can I help? How can we try this? Let's work collaboratively. If there's refusals or resistance to something, to really explain why that is, not just we don't do that here, to really kind of delve into that. So with that, I'm going to be quiet, turn things over to Whitney.
It was always so hard to follow. So I know that what you're thinking is that at this point, your head is spinning from a lot of information, a lot of great thoughts and strategies that Louise and Kim have already set you up with. But I'm here to tell you that we want to talk about what should ABA in the school setting look like. And I know that you've spent a lot of time, you know, if you were able to get ABA in your school setting, you decided that was the right fit for your student, you were able to work with your school team or your school district to get that in place. I'm here to tell you that the hard work is not yet done. So we know there are so many factors that go into deciding if comprehensive ABA in the classroom, not those evidence-based methodologies that are woven into special education, the way Louise highlighted, but the true comprehensive ABA program, if it's appropriate for your child and student. But it's equally important to be planful and intentional with the actual implementation of ABA in the setting. So we want to spend some time talking through that. The first consideration that you have to take in mind is to determine your objectives as a caregiver. So Louise and Kim have highlighted the ways that behavior analysis as a science is already part of special education, and some of the ways that you can work with your IEP team to enhance these strategies in your child's educational plan, to work toward achieving better outcomes, even without comprehensive ABA in your classroom. So if you get to this point where you have decided that you want ABA in your child's classroom, it's important to really spend some time thinking about what purpose does this service fulfill for your child, and what are the outcomes that you hope to achieve. When you're thinking about the outcomes, I really encourage you to be as specific and concrete as possible. Think about what goals will have the most immediate impact on your child's academic success. But please remember that ABA is not a crisis service. Often there's a lot of confusion around ABA, and a lot of people consider it synonymous with behavior reduction. But it's really important to know that that's not the case. And a comprehensive ABA program that takes place in the school should not center solely on reduction of problem behavior. There's certainly a high likelihood that that might be part of a comprehensive treatment plan. But there should also be new skills that we're teaching and growth that we're fostering in a variety of areas. So think about the immediate, but think about the short and long-term goals that you have for your child and how ABA can and should support them. What does ABA in your child's classroom look like for the rest of this semester, for the rest of the school year? How will we work to ensure that your child doesn't need this level of support as they move into the next grade or next school? And if they do need the support longer term, how does the service grow and evolve along with their needs? The next thing you have to think about is making sure that your ABA provider and your school team share your objectives, or at the very least that their goals align with your goals. This point is so important to emphasize, and I know Louise already has and Kim already has, but I'm going to get on that bandwagon of repeating it because it's a really important take-home message. The ABA team should not lead the academic, the social, or even behavioral objectives outlined in your IEP. The school team is still responsible for targeting not only the curriculum, whether your child is on the standard course of study or they access the extended content standards, but also their IEP goals, which we know can be academic or it can be social, emotional, behavioral in nature. The ABA team's role is to support the school team in implementation of these goals and to use their expertise in behavioral technology to enhance their learning, not replace it. So to do this effectively, the school team has to be an integral part of the ABA experience for your student, and they must be empowered to be active participants in treatment from the beginning. And a plan for fading ABA services has to, at minimum, be discussed from the very beginning of treatment, because the intent of any high-quality ABA provider is always going to be, whether it's in your home or in your school, to work themselves out of a job and to ensure that an individual's natural supports, and in this case, we're talking about parents and the school team, can learn to support their needs effectively without this high level of care. And I know what you're thinking. You're thinking, Whitney, we worked so hard to get ABA in the school. We considered all the aspects. We learned all the policies. We advocated. Why am I going to think about removing this service from my child's school from the beginning? But I'm telling you, that is best practice for ABA, and it's what's in the best interest of your child. Without a plan for discharge, it's all too easy for students who are receiving ABA in the school to become siloed and separated from their teachers, from their classmates, and from their instructional and naturally occurring social opportunities. So to do this well, roles have to be clear. Diffusion of responsibility can easily happen when there are this many players on a team and everyone is unsure of their roles and responsibilities, particularly with this service line, because this will be new to a lot of families, a lot of teachers, and a lot of administrators. So I recommend that you define these roles collaboratively, allow everybody a seat at the table and an opportunity to voice their opinions on how the team should work together effectively. Remember, as a parent, you are essentially the case managers in these situations, and you play an important role in bringing a team together and making sure that everyone is clear on what they should be doing. It's a lot of work, but it's the glue of what makes this successful. Your school team may have many players involved: teachers, instructional assistants, or in some school districts, they might be called teachers' assistants. your school administrators like the principal or assistant principal, specialty providers like occupational therapists or speech and language pathologists. They all play a really important role in interacting with your child and with each other. Then you have your ABA team, right? That's a whole new set of people. Generally, this is going to include a board certified behavior analyst or a BCBA. They're the graduate level technician that's responsible for overseeing the program. Then you have a registered behavior technician or an RBT. They're a paraprofessional and they're the person in the classroom each day. They're providing direct instruction that's prescribed by the BCBA. And in many cases, especially here in our state, this team might be supervised by a licensed psychologist who might provide oversight and consultation more behind the scenes to the BCBA. You might not see them as frequently as you might the BCBA or the RBT, but they're likely still involved in planning for care. So I recommend that right out of the gate, you express these roles, the responsibilities, and the types of communication that each team member is going to be responsible for, either before or after a team meeting. And this can take place in the context of an IEP. This can take place in another team meeting that you as a parent are entitled to call, but make sure this happens and make sure that you are working with a high quality BCBA who's going to support you in this type of collaboration, because that's really should be the vantage point of an effective clinician, is to know that collaboration is the key to success, and they should be eager to seek the support and the feedback from the rest of the team. So I want to talk a little bit more on how we clarify the different roles on the ABA team, because again, it's confusing to parents, it can be confusing to teachers. So it's important to remember that despite the fact that the RBT is with your child or with your student each day, working directly, targeting goals, they are not able to make treatment recommendations or to make changes to the teaching protocols they're running. That's the job of the BCBA. They're the person who provides training and supervision to the RBT. And even though they aren't physically present every day, that BCBA should be an active, involved member of the team. And you should see them in the classroom often, approximately weekly. BCBAs are also responsible for conducting assessments, developing the treatment plan, of course, in collaboration with caregivers and the school team, and they lead collaboration efforts with parents and with teachers. So both members of the ABA team serve really important roles, but it's incredibly important to keep those roles clear to avoid confusion and to minimize frustration, especially for teachers and for parents. So once you have that team established, you have good communication structure in place, it's time for services to begin. So this is a good look back slide as you're trying to remember the key points from this part of the talk, because these are the hallmarks of high quality ABA in the school setting. I'm going to talk through each one in more detail. So I know we're driving this message into the ground, but it really can't be emphasized enough. Caregivers are the foundation of quality communication. And as parents, you are driving the purpose of this service. And your values should be upheld in all of the work that's done for your student. And the only way to really ensure that this happens and that the trajectory of the service is in line with your objectives is to ensure solid, effective, and consistent communication across all parties. And for my teachers, my professionals, BCBAs, OTs, SLPs in the audience, I really want you to hear me when I say that everyone has a seat and a voice at the table. Though ABA is a specialized service, no one person is the expert on this student or how instruction or how intervention should be delivered. Everybody's perspectives are valuable here. And the only way that this partnership feels collaborative is for everyone involved understands that fundamental truth and that it's upheld through every interaction. And we've touched on this point already, but remember that communication starts by establishing that clear understanding of everyone's role on the team. And the most effective way to ensure that roles are upheld is to communicate often and document. Create daily communication logs. Get in the habit of starting a weekly team email for updates. Or I've even had families that I've worked with share a Google Doc that a parent created without any identifying information, of course. Everybody's upholding HIPAA here. But the teammates can log in and log real information and share back and forth in real time. So get creative, find what works for your team, talk to your BCBA or to your teacher, hear what has worked for them in the past or what felt too cumbersome to maintain. But find what works for your team and put it into action. So we've established already that ABA is a complement to instruction, not a replacement. The RBT or BCBA should not be the ones consistently delivering instructions, presenting academic tasks, or even solely managing behavioral episodes. Best practice is for this service to be a push in rather than a pull out model. We want your students to be spending their school day in the least restrictive environment, not pulled out and receiving separate instruction in a separate setting. So this means that for ABA to be effective in the school, the goals must align with the goals of the school team, which can look like goals that might address communication, engagement, or even social and emotional learning that could help to reduce unsafe or disruptive behaviors, if that's part of your concern and rationale for having ABA. The ABA team may even make recommendations for accommodations or environment or instruction, but services should be integrated into the natural environment and into the classroom. So that means that in your treatment planning, ABA goals should clearly align with the child's IEP or curriculum. So here's an example for you, and I know it's a lot of text, but it felt important to show what this could look like in real practice. So at the top, you see the North Carolina Extended Essential Standard, and you see that the one in question here reflects a high school level financial goal. The goal is applying, or the domain is applying math skills to consumer spending. That standard directly feeds into this IEP goal for Aaliyah. The goal here, which by the way, I borrowed straight from an IEP from an individual I used to support in high school. So this is an actual goal, an actual North Carolina-based IEP. So when given a calculator, Aaliyah will add 3 items under $9 each in 4 out of 5 opportunities. So what you're going to notice here about the ABA goal is that it's not the same as the IEP goal. It's not duplicative. It's much broader and it can apply across contexts in the school. But it still aligns with the objectives of the school team. So when provided necessary instructional materials, Aaliyah will follow multi-step instructions to complete a visually supported task. She will do so in at least 90% of opportunities across a minimum of 3 different tasks with at least 2 different instructors. That last piece there is important. That's the measurable piece. That's the piece that you and your team are going to look back on to monitor progress. And you're going to monitor progress both in the context of discussing progress within ABA and progress across the IEP goals. So progress monitoring in both sections are still incredibly important to make sure that we're working cohesively toward the same objectives, even though the goals might look slightly different. On the slide that Kim shared, outlining behavior analytics strategies in a school setting, you saw different evidence-based strategies that are rooted in the science of ABA and are often applied in the special education context. So when you're looking back at that last slide with the ABA goal that funnels up into that broader or that more specific, IEP goal, you should see these practices in action, supporting your student and achieving those goals. So though it's important to be in alignment with the school team, it's important for everybody to remember that most BCBAs are not special educators by trade or by training. So for example, you heard that when Louise introduced herself earlier, that she does have a background in education. She was a former special educator. She has her PhD in education, and she's a BCBA, a board certified behavior analyst. I, however, am not. My background and my license is in psychology, in addition to my BCBA certification. And that's going to be true across sort of the field of behavior analysis and BCBAs that you may come in contact with. There may be many of us who have a background and training in education, but that's not part of the coursework or training that we must go through in order to achieve our credential. So that's an important distinction to make. Also important to remember that even if you struck gold and Dr. Louise Southern was the BCBA on your program, she would not be acting as a special educator on the team, despite that experience and training that she has in education. That's important because it's crucial to remember that the school team should remain the driver of those educational objectives. ABA is not a replacement for academic instruction or for remediation. But with all of that being said, an effective ABA who's practicing in a school setting will work to make sure that they understand that educational context and that they understand the culture of the school so that the recommendations that they make are both appropriate for the student and are feasible for the setting. And so the last point that I want to make here, it might be the most important one. Collaboration is key to success for any team, but certainly for an ABA team operating in the school setting. And collaboration starts and ends with compassion. BCBAs and teachers, we walk alongside one another on these teams. But we as BCBAs must understand that our jobs and our responsibilities are often very different. We have the privilege and at times the luxury of narrowing our focus onto one child at a time in our practice. The teachers, they're often managing a full classroom and a full team of instructional assistants. We have to work first to understand their perspectives and the resources that are available to them before we design an intervention or we suggest a particular strategy. We have to be receptive to their feedback when they tell us that the interventions aren't working or that they're not feasible for them. We have to be creative in our approach to troubleshooting those barriers and finding solutions that will work for the school team and for the student. We have to be humble in our approach and empathetic in our communication. Teachers, on the other hand, we ask that you sort of meet us where we are, that you're open and candid with your expectations, with your feedback on our interventions, and help us to meet in the middle as we both creatively work towards solutions for what ultimately is everyone's goal, the progress and success of this student in your classroom. So we must be intentional in our collaboration. Schedule those meetings and updates. Don't just wait for them to happen. Despite seeing each other every day, you will be surprised at how quickly the weeks and months and semester can fly by before you've had the chance to really be planful in your collaboration if you are intentional in scheduling it. So make a plan for communication, whether it's via email, written daily log, or scheduled phone call. Make those expectations clear from day one and really hold each other accountable. And remember that the sign of a successful ABA program is one that ends in discharge, based on progress, based on meeting goals. This has to be a point of discussion from the beginning, with clear objectives outlined and measurable criteria that everyone agrees on. So I will leave you with this quote before I hand it back to Louise. Just a reminder that alone we can do so little, but together we can do so much.
Thank you, Whitney. So I know this was a lot of information, a lot of really important information. We know that we're at 12:55 and we are ready to stay on longer than 1 o'clock for questions. It was just so important for us to lay out a foundation of this information to you all. And so just in quick summary, before we jump into Q&A, just some key points to remember. In that first section, I talked about, if you don't remember anything else I said, remember that behavior analytic strategies and the science of behavior analysis is already inextricably woven into high quality educational services. Part 2 of that is Kim's section, right? Where she talked about the importance of us understanding what the concepts, the main principles under the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act are. And one of those key concepts of a free and appropriate public education, or FAPE. What does that word appropriate really mean? And how do we unpack that to understand what we should expect in terms of specially designed instruction and educational service delivery when we're thinking about our students with disabilities. And then, of course, Whitney's section on if we are providing behavior analytics services in a school setting provided by an outside BCBA, for example, what should that service look like? What are some of the quality indicators? What are the guidelines? How can we assure that we are delineating roles and responsibilities? How do we assure that from the outset, the goal is to fade us out of our jobs? And how do we work in close partnership with those school-based teams? So those are some of those key points we hope you can remember. Again, we're not taking one position or another on this issue. It's a complex issue, and we are here to support all the stakeholder groups